Welcome to this rapid revision video looking at a case study, in this case, the Gunpowder Plot of 1605. Let's have a look at the backgrounds of the Gunpowder Plot, particularly Catholic persecution. The Act of Uniformity in 1559 made Protestantism the official religion of England. Following the Pope's excommunication of Elizabeth, the freedom of English Catholics to practice their religion was much reduced. Catholic Mary, Queen of Scots, was even executed as a threat to the crown in 1587. Elizabeth died without an heir in 1603, so James VI of Scotland became James I of England and Scotland. He had been raised as a Protestant, despite being Mary, Queen of Scots' son. James I had married a Catholic, but hopes of more tolerance were very short-lived. James passed increasingly harsh laws against English Catholics. A number of them wanted to act in revenge. So what were the aims of the plot? Robert Catesby was the leader of the plot. His anger had built up as his family was affected by James's anti-Catholic laws. His father had been imprisoned for sheltering a priest, and Catesby refused to take the Protestant oath as James I's law demanded. He was dismissed from university for this refusal, and he never finished his degree. Catesby assembled a group of Catholic plotters to kill the king, many of which can be seen in this contemporary picture. This included a royal bodyguard, Thomas Percy, his cousins Thomas and Robert Winter, Jack and Christopher Wright, Thomas Bates, John Grant, Ambrose Rookwood, Sir Everard Digby and Francis Tresham. However, the most famous conspirator would eventually be the explosive specialist, Guy Fawkes, otherwise known as Guido. They intended to blow up Parliament during the state opening due for the 5th of November 1605, using gunpowder. At a stroke, this would kill all of the Protestant elite in England. They then intended to install James I's daughter Elizabeth as a puppet queen. They saw themselves as religious soldiers fighting an unjust power. Today, they would fit the definition of terrorists. Despite their plans, the plot failed. Let's consider why. The plotters first met on the 20th of May 1604. They rented a house near the Parliament buildings in Westminster, where Guy Fawkes posed as a servant in the house. They were able to rent storage space under the House of Lords and gradually stashed over a ton of gunpowder in 36 barrels in the cellar. Yes, that is how relaxed security was. You could literally rent a space under the House of Lords and fill it with whatever you liked. I don't think that they would admit, though, that they were stashing gunpowder there. However, the plot soon began to fall apart. On the 20th of October 1605, the Catholic Lord Monteagle received a warning letter, likely written by his relative Francis Tresham. Here is that original letter, and in case you can't quite make out the words on it, I'll read it to you. It reads, "My Lord, out of the love I bear to some of your friends, I have a care of your preservation. Therefore I would advise you, as you tender your life, to devise some excuse to shift your attendance at this Parliament. For God and man hath concurred to punish the wickedness of this time. And think not slightly of this advertisement, but retire yourself into your country, where you may expect the event in safety. For though there be no appearance of any stir, yet I say they shall receive a terrible blow this Parliament, and yet they shall not see who hurts them. This counsel is not to be condemned, because it may do you good, and it can do you no harm, for the danger is past as soon as you have burnt the letter. And I hope God will give you the grace to make good use of it, to whose holy protection I commend you." The bit that really sticks out to me is "they shall not see who hurts them," a real hint at the intended method of the murders. The letter was not burned. It was instead passed on to James I's spymaster, Robert Cecil. Parliament was raided and the gunpowder discovered, with Guy Fawkes guarding it. He could hardly have been more red-handed. What followed was Guy Fawkes' interrogation. He'd initially tried to say that he was a man called John Johnson. If that sounds like a fake name to you, it certainly did to Robert Cecil too, and the lie did not stand long. Some historians believe that Cecil knew of the plot all along. In securing the gunpowder, Fawkes had travelled to Flanders. English spies had already monitored his movements. Cecil may have wanted the plot to thicken to gain a greater glory for defeating it, and moreover to then justify further attacks on Catholic freedoms to curb potential rebellion, and simply because Robert Cecil hated Catholics. Cecil wanted a confession, and he would use torture to secure it. But in England, torture was only allowed under very special circumstances, and this required specific permission from the king. This permission was forthcoming, and here it is. If he will not otherways confess, the gentler tortures are to be first used unto him. God speed your good work, James I. Fawkes was placed on the rack. This instrument of torture stretched its victims by his arms and legs until joints dislocated, muscle, sinew and tendons tore, and the accused could stand the pain no longer. 12 days after his arrest, after suffering agonising torture in the Tower of London, Fawkes finally confessed. This was Fawkes's confession. Catesby suggested making a mine under the upper house of Parliament because religion had been unjustly suppressed there. 20 barrels of gunpowder were moved to the cellar. It was agreed to seize Lady Elizabeth, the King's eldest daughter, and to proclaim her Queen. We know that Guy Fawkes had signed various documents before. Here is his name, Guido Fawkes. But the signature on the confession was all he could muster after days of brutal torture. He just about wrote out Guido with his broken fingers, and then just a couple of scratches for the rest of his name. Following Fawkes's confession, we move on to the arrest and execution of the other conspirators. Most of the conspirators were quickly captured, despite some making a disastrous last stand at Catesby's home. And when I say disastrous, I really do mean it. Their gunpowder was wet, so they tried to dry it by the fire, and they even partially blew themselves up. Some people were actually killed resisting arrest, but for the others, their trial began in January 1606. They were charged, predictably, with treason. They were also, equally predictably, found guilty. They were sentenced to a traitor's death. This meant being hanged, drawn and quartered. This is something I've covered in a previous video, so you might already know it, but I'm now going to describe the process to you. And if you're a bit squeamish, you might want to skip it. They were hanged by the neck until they were almost dead. But then, usually with a splash of water, they were revived so they knew what was going on for the next bit. They had their genitals cut off and burned in front of them whilst they were still alive. They were then disemboweled, also whilst still alive, though it's doubtful that they would have remained alive for long. And then they had their limbs and then their heads hacked off, with these parts sent to different parts of the kingdom as a deterrent. Such a public and gruesome death was intended as a deterrent at a time when the king feared other Catholics planning a similar attack. James had enforced his laws and his authority in a terrifying manner. So what were the consequences of the Gunpowder Plot? We can see in this contemporary engraving James I in front of his parliament. The plot was well publicised, with engravings produced of the conspirators and their deaths. King James himself wrote his own account, published in the so-called King's Book. This encouraged anti-Catholic feeling across the country. The 1605 Thanksgiving Act ordered that the events of the plot be remembered each 5th of November. And in fact that has happened and still happens. Remember, the 5th of November, gunpowder, treason and plot. I see no reason why gunpowder treason should ever be forgot. Today, this survives as Bonfire or Guy Fawkes Night. There were additional restrictions on English Catholics passed by Parliament after the plot. Catholics were banned from becoming officers in the army or serving in the legal professions. The 1605 Popish Recusants Act forced Catholics to take an oath of allegiance to the king. This also increased the recusancy fines for refusing to attend Church of England services each Sunday. Some restrictions lasted for a very long time indeed. Catholics were still forbidden from becoming MPs and had restrictions on owning land, and Catholics were banned from voting until as late as 1829. Let's sum up our final points. The Gunpowder Plot was a 1605 plot to kill King James I. It was a response to increasingly harsh anti-Catholic laws in England. The plot was led by Catholic gentleman Robert Catesby, but its most famous participant was Guy Fawkes. The plotters intended to blow up Parliament on November the 5th, killing the king and most of the Protestant nobility. They then intended to place James's daughter Elizabeth on the throne as a puppet queen who they could control. This was essentially an act of terrorism. The plot was discovered following Lord Monteagle's handing over of a warning letter. However, Spymaster Robert Cecil had likely already been monitoring the plotters and had knowledge of it. Fawkes was captured red-handed in the cellar with the gunpowder. James I gave permission for torture to be used to extract a confession from Fawkes. He was tortured on the rack and did eventually confess. He and his surviving co-conspirators were sentenced to be hanged, drawn and quartered, a traitor's death. Even harsher and longer-lasting restrictions against Catholics followed, some of them lasting centuries. That's the end of this video. Thanks for watching it. I hope it's been useful to you, and if it has, please do like the video and consider subscribing to the channel. It all helps. If it's something that you're desperate for me to cover, please leave a comment below and I'll see what I can do. But for now, I'll say thanks very much for watching, and remember, the 5th of November, Gunpowder Treason and Plot. I see no reason why gunpowder treason should ever be forgot.